Welcome back to the Born Handy channel, where we take on any kind of project that a handyman might be asked to take on, plus a little extra. This video probably falls more into the little extra side of things, and we're going to be building a new computer. Repairing computers is something that I've done for a long time. As a matter of fact, I've changed out every single component on a computer with the exception of a power supply, and I've never moved everything from one tower to another. So this should go fairly smoothly. I will say that I'm not a professional, so some of you guys maybe that watch the Vox Media computer build and really tore those guys to shreds, hopefully you'll go a little easier on me. Having said that, this video is a little bit of a tutorial showing you at very least how I built my computer, and hopefully could serve as some sort of guide if you were trying to build your own. So with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. I got a bunch of parts up here. I'm not going to cover these now. I'll go into what they are as they're put into the system. I will put in the description what each one of these are, so if you want to go back and check that out, it'll be there. There are some other parts that are not shown up here, things such as the keyboard, the monitor, the other peripherals. They're just going to be in the way at this stage in the build, so they'll come later on. Plus, I do have a couple of things that are going to be migrating over from my old computer, and so they're not shown here either. Step one is going to be to clear off the work surface. We'll start off with the tower. This tower is a complete mystery to me. What is this tower? This tower is the Rosewill Prism S500. Definitely Steve over at Gamers Nexus would not approve of this tower. The reality is, I bought it for the look. The reality also is, I'm not trying to do any major overclocking here. As a matter of fact, I'm going to do very little gaming. This computer is mostly for video editing, so it's going to serve well for what we're trying to do, and it should move plenty of heat, so I'm not too concerned about it. I know that it maybe has some mixed reviews on the internet, but I like the look of an RGB build. I picked this tower to build an RGB computer. So we're going to start off by removing the back panel, which is done with just a couple of thumb screws. Then the panel comes off. The next panel is this tempered glass panel. It is glass, so be mindful of that. We definitely don't want to drop it like that, or set it anywhere that it could be knocked over and broken. So I'm going to set it somewhere for extra safekeeping. So now we have the internals of the tower, and this tower came with 3 fans pre-installed along the bottom as well as 1 fan on the back, and it was a pretty good price, so I feel like I got a good bargain when I bought this computer. And I'm going to set it over here out of the way now that I have all those things ready, and we're going to bring up the motherboard right after we bring up the processor and the RAM. Okay, so now we're going to bring up the motherboard. This is the Aurus X570. This is a Wi-Fi built-in motherboard, and it is from Gigabyte. There's a ton of options out there for motherboards. One of the things that can happen when you get online and you start doing some research as to which motherboard and part you're going to go with, one of the things you're going to find is that everybody has an opinion, and they'll say this board is no good, that board is superior. Honestly, the water's kind of muddy. I think the reality is the computer parts, for the most part, have gotten so good that when we're picking apart what makes one board better than another, we've kind of gotten down into the weeds about some things that may not be even important to most users. So for me, I bought a motherboard that I liked and that was well reviewed and had a ton of reviews online, not something that was fairly new or just had 1 or 2. I'm going to be using the motherboard box as a work surface right after I bang it on the tower. One thing you shouldn't do, don't handle your motherboard and be touching around down here if you can help it. Just go ahead and hold it from the edges, or you can pick it up. Usually you're safe to pick up from a heatsink. So in this case, I've got it set and we're ready to go. Oh yeah, something else I forgot to mention. You should probably be wearing some sort of anti-static bracelet, whether it be on your wrist or on your ankle. I live in a part of the country where the humidity is insanely high, and it's just not as big of a risk here. But however, there still is a risk, so proceed with caution if you should choose not to do that. This may be a better example for me to just simply say, do as I say, not as I do, and get yourself an anti-static wrist bracelet. One of the other things that's important about picking out all of your parts is to make sure that the parts are compatible. There are lots of tools online that you can use to kind of help yourself make sure that there isn't going to be any conflict. I used PC Part Picker. I know that people say that you can't just go by that. But in addition to PC Part Picker, I also spent a little bit of time additionally researching the parts on their own to make sure they were compatible. And in my instance, PC Part Picker got it perfect every time. So I've gone with the Ryzen 9 3900X. This is not the hottest processor that money can buy today, but it is a pretty good processor, 12 cores, which is not really needed for gaming, but it's going to do really well when it comes to video editing, so this is a win in my book. Open this very carefully. God, I felt like that case was going to pop and sling the processor. So one of the things you definitely don't want to do is be handling a lot of this. The bottom side of this processor is covered in these little golden pins. These pins are soft and are easy to bend and easy to break. So with the processor unpacked, we're ready to set it into the motherboard. So we're first going to raise up this tray. Now we're going to take our processor. We're going to line up the gold triangle in the lower left corner of this processor. Happens to be another triangle in the lower left corner of the socket. You should line those two up, and then your processor will drop right into place. There we go. Once you think it's in, give it a couple wiggles to make sure that it's seated. Then you push the lever back down, and your processor has been installed. For the RAM, I've gone with the CORSAIR Vengeance Pro. These are 16 gigabyte sticks. I should have taken a moment to read and make sure which slots these go to if you're splitting it up. I didn't do that. I am expecting another box sometime today, so I'm just going to put them in that way, and when the other RAM arrives, I will place it in. The other thing to be mindful of is that your RAM has a slot right along the edge of these fingers, and there's a correlating notch in the motherboard, and that'll allow you to make sure that you line it up properly. This will only go in one way, so if it feels like it's giving you too much resistance, stop and don't push too hard. Having said that, you do have to push the RAM into the spot. And so once you get it, give it a little push, you should hear a couple of clicks. Boom. And if I didn't mention it, before you push it in, you're going to have to push this little slot backwards, and it will the RAM won't go in otherwise, and when you push it in, you should see that slot close. Next up is our solid state drive. So how do I open the box? Don't throw your computer hardware, it's not good for it. So here we have the Samsung 1TB M.2 drive, the 970 EVO. This board has multiple M.2 slots. I'm going to be using the top slot because generally speaking, one of the slots is specifically intended for your operating system, and in my case, it's the top slot. So we just take the screw out, lift it up. Notice that there is some peel away material here. We're going to add our M.2 card. It presses into the slot just like this at an angle, and then you would press it down. There should be a standoff here. I don't have the standoff in place just yet. This motherboard has a standoff first. That goes in wherever your M.2 ends, because not all M.2 drives are the same length. So somewhere in the bag, there should be a tiny little screw that is for your M.2 drive. And here it is. Now we can put our typical M.2 screw onto the standoff. And now we are back to our heat block. Okay, with the M.2 drive and the heatsink back into the motherboard, we're just about ready to put the motherboard into the tower, but the water cooler has some mounting hardware that's going to need to go onto the motherboard first, and I want to go ahead and mount that now rather than try to do it after the motherboard is in the tower. So there are some pre-installed plastic clips on either side of the CPU. Those are going to need to come off in order to attach the water cooler block. Hang on to them, you never know when you might want to sell this motherboard used, or they may be needed in some other application. The water cooler kit comes with its own set of screws and own set of hardware, and we're going to be doing that next. So with that out of the way, we lift the board, and we can lose this back plate. And it comes with these plastic spacers. They basically prevent you from pulling this metal into the motherboard, possibly causing a short circuit and ruining your motherboard. So we're going to be sure and get those spacers aligned up properly. Now I can turn the board back over, and we can resume. We're going to drop in our 4 spacers over the screws. These spacers space the water block the appropriate height off of the processor. Okay, now we should be ready to place the motherboard inside of the tower. Looks like I'm going to need to remove the fan to make this work. More often than not, your motherboard is going to come with a plate that's not connected, and you're going to need to attach that. In my case, it came pre-assembled, and if I were to take it off, I wouldn't be able to reattach it once it were in the case. Don't set your board down on the bottom of the unit and then slide it. You would almost definitely damage some of the circuits that are on the back, rendering the motherboard completely useless. So what we want to do is come in very carefully at an angle, taking a little extra care to clear any obstacles, line up the I/O slot as best we can while still in the air, and set it down on top of the standoffs, trying to make sure that we've lined up all the holes and making sure that there are no additional standoffs that may be rubbing against the back of the motherboard. My case was bought as an ATX case. This is an ATX board, And so in my case, it looks like everything lines up perfectly. Don't tighten these screws up just yet. Just get them started. You may need to move the motherboard just so slightly so that the rest of the screws can drop into the standoffs. If you prematurely tighten a handful of screws, you may make it impossible to move the motherboard in the event that one of your screws doesn't exactly line up with the standoffs. After all the screws have been dropped in place, you can go back around and tighten them all up. This plate here in this particular case is for my water cooler. I want it out of the way just so that I can reach through the case if I need to help me get some of these cables in place. Last piece out. And up with the power supply. I did go with a Seasonic 850 watt. It is a Gold Plus rated. This is a fully modular power supply, so the cables in my case are going to be separate from the actual power supply itself. So this looks like the first connector that I'm going to go. This one will go to the motherboard. When you go to do your power supply, mileage may vary, but in my case it looks like most of the stuff will only plug in into one place, and your motherboard is pretty much always going to get this large, I think this is a 24-pin connector. I'm going to come through here initially. In my instance, all of these are labeled, for example, PSU, power supply unit, CPU. So I'm going to find where this one goes. I've got a label here that says CPU PCIe, and in she goes. And let me figure out where I'm going to plug this one in. At this point, I am going to go ahead and install the radiator, and I'll just drop it in like so. Now we're going to go try to find our screws and get this thing set up. With that out of the way, now I want to get the fans mounted to the radiator. Now it is important to note which direction your fans are going to move air. For the most part, fans move air toward the actual fan motor. The fan motor mount is on this side. You can see the grill is here. And so our fans are going to be moving air in this direction, which means we want to pull air out of the case through the radiator. So our fans are going to go just like this. So there is a pretty fierce debate out there among even the experts about how to apply thermal paste. Some people suggest that a few dots. Some people suggest 3 lines. Other people have all kinds of different suggestions about how to do it. My suggestion is they all probably work to some degree. But I did recently watch a video where thermal paste was applied in sort of an X pattern, and they used a clear glass to press down onto the CPU. And as it turns out, of all the patterns that they tested, the X was by far the most effective. So the X pattern is what I'm going to be going with. Be sure and remove this. I almost applied it without doing that. And at this point, I can reapply these spring-loaded thumb screws. Okay, water cooler in place. Now let's try to figure out where to plug it up. Okay, so now we're moving on to the single hardest to get part that I had for this build, and that is going to be the GPU. So this is my primary GPU slot, and we're going to go ahead and install it here. So I'm going to need to remove the correlating covers for the GPU slot. So down on your motherboard, if it isn't already, you're going to make sure and push this back for your PCIe slot. And here comes our GPU. So the GPU, I have removed the wrong access panels. Okay, so with that fixed, now we're going to go in with our GPU. Very carefully look and make sure that you are aligned with your slot. And press it down. You should hear a click, much like the click that we heard for the RAM. Right back on with our cover, and the GPU is almost fully installed. All that's left to do is to plug in the cables. I did route these cables through a little bit earlier on. 1, 2. Let's stand up the tower. And last thing for this case, I'll place the wireless antenna up top. It's magnetic. And then I've got these 2 wireless connectors. One is slightly larger than the other, so no, they're not. They're both identical. So both of them being the same size, I'm hoping that it doesn't matter which way that they go. If my internet doesn't seem to work well, I'll reverse it. Maybe I'll dig into the manual later and we'll figure it out. And that pretty much wraps up every last thing that we had to put in on this tower. A couple things I did it off camera. I did a little bit of wire management. I know that it's not the greatest. I was going for functionality, so I did clean it up as best I could, and it does function pretty well. So I have added a 2 terabyte hard drive. I've also added a 1 terabyte solid state drive, and this is the RGB controller that came from the water cooler. I had intended to use this and replace this one, but what I found is that when I did that, not all of them would work. So the only way I've been able to make all of these RGB lights come on and be synchronized is to use some of them on this, some of them over here. I don't have a good explanation for why that may be, other than RGB software is notoriously well known for being pretty poorly written and just not being compatible with other companies. But in my case, I did get it to work, at very least, with the supplied remote. Another issue that I had with this system is once I had everything and I plugged everything up and turned it on, the system would not post. As it turns out, this motherboard did need a BIOS update in order to operate. The BIOS update was super easy to do. The one thing that I would tell you if you were trying to replicate this build is this white USB port is the one that you're going to need to plug in the USB stick in when you press the button on the motherboard that tells it to go ahead and flash the BIOS. So with the GPU in, the BIOS flashed, let's go ahead and get this computer started up and make a few customizations. One of the reasons that I chose this tower is that front cover that's basically a blank canvas. I was going to use it to do some customization. At the risk of being called dork, I'm a huge Star Trek fan, and the last several computers I've had have all been named after something in Star Trek. This particular computer is going to be named and themed after the USS Vengeance that we saw in Star Trek's Into Darkness movie. Even though that ship only had one movie and not a whole lot of screen time in the grand scheme of things, I really liked that ship. I thought it was a fantastic concept, and so I did name this computer after that ship, and I wanted to theme this computer after that ship. Although the movie set font is available for download, the movie font doesn't really bring the aggression that this ship has, and so I did find online a pretty good example where someone else had taken the word vengeance and tried to make the word itself look vengeful, and I liked what they did, and so I have done my part to kind of duplicate that. These particular stickers here are what you would find on top of the nacelles of the Enterprise D, and I even went as far as to choosing these speakers because they do remind me of an Enterprise nacelle. And when they go on either side of the monitor, they look a little bit like a Star Trek ship design. And so I did put the stickers on top of the speakers, as well as one inside the tower. I've also got a model of the Vengeance ship that I'm going to include in the tower somewhere. Overall, I've been super happy with the build. I thought it came out fantastic. There are a couple of things that I wish we could have done better, but the reality is these things are beyond my control. And that's namely how the RGB software is not really good at communicating from one brand to the next. It almost makes me wish that I would have held out a little longer and kept everything brand specific. I think maybe if I'd have kept everything on one brand, perhaps ASUS or Gigabyte, maybe at that point everything would have been better at communicating and the RGB would have been a little bit easier to use. That's not a huge deal at the end of the day. As far as testing the computer, I've had great success with rendering videos. I've gone through and tested some things from my old computer to this one, and this computer here seems to be able to render video at about 8 times faster as kind of a general average. One other thing that I wish I would have done differently, I do kind of wish that I didn't have to buy such an expensive GPU. The reality is that this year and the last year both, GPUs have been very hard to get your hands on, and scalpers have kind of ruined the market, and I kind of feel like that the manufacturers are not doing much to prevent it. The retailers are not doing much to prevent it, and you could argue that it's probably beyond their control as well. But I completely disagree. I think that if they would allow you to pre-order these things, and even though it may be 4, 5, 6 months down the road before you get it, at least if you knew it was coming, you could pay MSRP. And I think for a lot of people that would eliminate the need for checking every day, constant refreshing, signing up for instant push notifications, and even still by the time you get the notification and get online and looking, they're already sold out. But I'm not in charge of that sort of thing, and I'll come down off my high horse now. I'd like to take a minute to thank you for watching and ask that you go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I'm getting pretty close to that magical 1,000 subscribers mark. And if you've enjoyed this Star Trek themed computer build, please share this video with somebody else who you think might enjoy it as well. So, until next time, this is Jason, and this has been the Star Trek themed PC build with Born Handy.